Hello, I'm Kate Chapers, and I'm director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which is part of our 2024 Great Decisions series. Our speaker today is Rick Olson, and our topic is Understanding Indonesia. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built on the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose lands we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. So a little bit about our speaker today. Rick Olson is a retired professional with a variety of educational and life experiences. He's worked as an economist, an attorney, a certified financial planner, an agricultural loan officer, an agricultural co-op president, a state representative in Michigan, and a public school business manager. He obtained a JD from Stanford Law School and completed coursework in 2 PhD programs, agricultural economics and education administration. An avid traveler, he's been to 44 countries and all 50 of the United States. He's flown to the Nakavi refugee settlement in Uganda 3 times since February 2020 to guide a nonprofit organization he founded to assist the refugees at Best Future School, and now at 4 such learning centers. He's also led the effort on 3 Rotary International Global Grants for refugee settlement camps in Uganda. He's involved in the support of efforts of Sustainable Cambodia. And Rick is also an adventurer, having climbed Mount McKinley in Alaska in 1977, riding his bicycle across the US in 2016. He did a 19-day trek to the base camp of Mount Everest in 2017 and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania in 2019. He led Rotary International tours through Eastern Europe in 2019 and again in 2022. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship between Ramsey County Library, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. And we are deeply grateful to all these organizations for their support and to bring these talks to our communities. So now let's turn things over to our speaker, Rick Olson. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Glad to be here. Let me start my presentation here and we'll get rolling. Okay, the title of this talk is Invisible Indonesia. But before I start the talk on invisible Indonesia itself, I've asked by Global Minnesota to do a quick introduction to Global Minnesota. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that has a lot of programs that help Minnesota understand the world better. The mission is to advance international understanding and engagement. It's been around for over 70 years, got 16 staff members, and it's supported by individual and corporate members. We've got a wide variety of programs. The World Affairs programs that are free and some that are low cost. They're virtual and both virtual and in person. There's also professional exchanges, over 300 visitors from 100 countries in 2023. Had some program in K-12 education, and then this Great Decision discussion groups, which this program is part of. So a lot of activities covering a lot of countries and reaching over 15,000 people. So these Great Decision discussions are actually a part of the Foreign Policy Association's Great Decision program, as that's the organization that provides the book. And then Global Minnesota organizes local expert speakers. So there's a lot of groups around Minnesota, but it's important to note that any opinions that you hear me state today are my opinions and not Global Minnesota's or Foreign Policy Association. Take it for what it's worth from what I say. So if you want to learn more about Global Minnesota, there are weekly newsletters. You can become a member. Or you could subscribe to the Global Minnesota podcast. You can also follow Global Minnesota on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So lots of opportunities, particularly for people who are in the metro area, and also the virtual events that outstate people can participate. So with that, we'll get into invisible in Indonesia. What we'll cover today is an introduction to Indonesia. Then we'll cover some of the history and what the strategic importance of Indonesia is. And that is what is really at stake in the current elections there that'll happen next Wednesday. So we'll start with a little bit of geography. Indonesia is called an archipelago, which is defined as a chain of islands. It's got over 17,000 islands, and over 6,000 of them are inhabited. Just scattered over quite a large area there in Southeast Asia. It's the 14th largest country by area in the country, and 4th largest by population. But what's interesting about it is how diverse it is ethnically, linguistically, and culturally. So developing a national identity was really an issue for Indonesia. Now, it's again, in part of its diversity, in the island of Java, more than half of the inhabitants of Indonesia are on this island, and Jakarta, its capital, has over 10 million people of the almost 280 million people altogether. Interestingly enough, the capital of Jakarta is actually going to be moved into the island of Borneo here because Jakarta is so jam-packed with vehicles and so forth. You can't get around very easily. And interestingly enough, there's a number of islands or rivers, I should say, that flow through Jakarta, and in the monsoon season, there's significant floodings. And so anyway, the capital of Indonesia will be moved. It may take a few more years to build that up. But another interesting fact is that not only is it large in terms of population and physical area, but its gross domestic product, depending on how you rank it, it's either 7th or 16th in the world. So it's a big deal. And interestingly enough, we call it invisible Indonesia because I don't know how much you know about Indonesia, but before I started studying this for this presentation, after traveling to 44 countries, frankly, I knew darn little about it. So it's interesting. Although it's quite large in terms of total economy, when you start looking at the gross domestic product per capita, which is this column here, you look down here, it's only 6.4% of the GDP per capita of the United States. So it's quite low, about half of what Brazil is, although it is larger than per capita of India. So it's not a rich country on a per person basis. But it is a diverse economy right now. Industry and services big. They're dominated by agriculture. So it's considered an emerging economy. Member of the G20, which is a pretty big deal. And some economists are predicting that by 2045, it will be in the top 4, which is pretty big. However, there's other economists says that it does face a challenge. Many growing economies, when they get out of this poverty stage, they get to what they call the middle income trap, where the wages are too high to really be attracting much more foreign investment for manufacturing, but the productivity is too low to be competitive. So there's a race between how fast their productivity is growing and how fast the population is growing. So we'll see. The jury's out on what will happen with Indonesia's economy. Now, the major industries in Indonesia, agriculture still has 41% of the labor force, and palm oil is basically the world's largest producer. A lot of cinnamon and cloves and so forth. It is a member of OPEC, so it does have oil and gas manufacturing, and also non-oil and gas manufacturing, mining, which we'll talk about more later, particularly about nickel and copper. Trade is huge, and hotels and restaurants with tourism. But it's a mixed economy because the government is one of the biggest owners of enterprises in the nation, with a total of 141 enterprises owned by the government. So it's not totally a capitalistic economy. Indonesia is a major trade partner with many countries. It's a major part of the economy. As far as the imports, over 18% of GDP is imported, and over 21% of its economy are in exports. And China is the big dog in this, in both imports and exports, and we'll come back to that later. So there's major exports. Palm oil is the big one. We'll come back to that later as well. And it does have significant amount of coal. And nickel is a big deal. We'll come back to that later. It's more coal and then copper and other metals. So it has major exports in some very critical minerals. Okay, we'll come back to nickel very quickly here. Indonesia is the largest nickel producer in the world, producing about half of the total world production. And recently, the current president, Joko Widodo, actual name is Joko Widodo, but he's known as Joko Widodo. He's banned the exportation of nickel without it first being processed in Indonesia. And that has, got some pushback from countries that want free trade and so forth. But this is really important because nickel is a key component in the production of batteries, critical to the effort to combat climate change. So big deal. With the election coming up next Wednesday, pundits expect this policy to continue into the future administrations. But this being raised as an issue is not surprising. That's because when we talk about the history of Indonesia, with it being colonialized, many of the colonialized nations were exploited by the country dominating it by the export of raw materials and bringing the more high value production or processing back into the home country. And so Joko Widodo is trying to prevent that happening here with nickel in Indonesia. Now, tourism is a major component of Indonesia's economy. Among goods and services, it's ranked 4th. And when you rank tourism worldwide, country by country, it's ranked 20th. So it's got a lot of tourists, over 11 million in 23, which is actually down from some from in 2019, primarily because of the pandemic. It's recovering. But not surprising, the country of origin for the tourists are primarily those that are close, and the United States has some impact, although not that terribly big when you compare the US tourists to other parts of the world. Now, Indonesia is a land of contrasts, very high density in Jakarta, and then very sparsely populated in West New Guinea, which is populated by the indigenous people. It has high mountains, such as the highest one, Mount Rinjani, and then it has the beautiful Bali beaches. So a lot to see. Borneo with its tropical forests, second only to the Amazon, it's said, in terms of tropical forests. So a lot to see in Indonesia. Now, this map shows, just a lot of mountains. In fact, all these islands obviously are made because of these many volcanoes, many of them which are active, and minor earthquakes and eruptions are not uncommon because Indonesia is in the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the plates of the earth are crashing into each other and so forth, causing all this volcanic activity. Now, rainfall is plentiful, particularly in the monsoon season here in the December area. But the weather is characterized by the rainy seasons and the dry seasons, because here which is our summer, they're on the equator, so you can't say it's their winter. But during our summer, there is a dry season here. So if you want to travel, you got to take this into consideration. But straddling the equator, Indonesia is a tropical country with wet, hot, humid climate the entire year. And you can see the temperatures here, 87, 89, 90. Oh, there's nothing there as a high lower than 87. And the low, nothing lower than 76. So it's going to be hot. It's going to be wet. So the best time to visit Indonesia is between April and October, in case this presentation piques your interest for travel. Okay, we'll switch to the history. Indonesia has been inhabited for a long, long time, perhaps as long as 2 million years ago. But Homo sapiens got there about 43,000 years ago. Then the modern population came from Taiwan around 2000 BCE, before Christ, is basically what that means, and basically pushed the then current natives to the eastern regions of these islands. Over time, there have been very significant naval kingdoms that flourished because of the strategic location for trade. The Buddhist and Hindu dynasties also thrived, and then over time declined during this long period of history. Islam arrived around the 13th century and is now the predominant religion in Indonesia today. In fact, this map shows the green as the Muslim majority. 87% of the Indonesia's population is Muslim. And Indonesia has the world's largest Muslim population, estimated at 229 million. And this is primarily of the Sunni branch of Islam, similar to most of the Muslim world. And that's in contrast to Iran, which is primarily Shia. Now, the implications of this is that they typically side with the Palestinians and against Israel on the world stage, but it's not really active all that terribly much. It's not like being in a Middle East Muslim country. Now, the colonial era started when the Europeans arrived in 1512, and nearly a century later, the Dutch East India Company was established there and really dominated. When you think of a country being dominated by a country, no, this is dominated by a company from Dutch, until the Netherlands established the Dutch East Indies in 1799. So that was going on until the Japanese invasion in World War II. But during that time, there was a lot of turmoil. People don't like being ruled by outsiders, and so there was a lot of turmoil during much of this time period. But after World War II, in August 1945, Indonesia declared their independence. And one of the leaders of all this nationalist efforts prior to World War II, Sukarno, he assumed the presidency. Now, because of all this turmoil before and resistance to being subjugated colonial citizens and then gaining the independence, that was a major part of Indonesia gaining their national identity, with the idea of being one country, one people, one language. And so that's a big thing when you look at Indonesia, even in current period, that idea. Now, the Sukarno rule was looking very, very promising at first, very much a democratic tendency, but over time, it eroded into authoritarianism. And there was, different power bases, the military, political Islam, and the Communist Party of Indonesia was growing significantly. And obviously, being a Cold War era, the United States was kind of afraid of what was going to be happening there in Indonesia, because China was communist. North Korea, after the Korean War, was communist. Vietnam ultimately became communist, and they really didn't want any more dominoes to fall. So anyway, there was a lot of tensions during that time between the military and the Communist Party of Indonesia. And there was a kind of perhaps might have been a staged coup. Anyway, it instigated a violent anti-communist purge led by a Major General Suharto. During that time, it may be as much as 1 million communists or communist supporters were killed, just a huge genocide, and roughly 1 million more left-leaning people were put in concentration camps. A big stain on Indonesian history. But out of that, Suharto, he became president in 1967. He pushed aside Sukarno. And his administration, again, was supported by the U.S., again, because of the Cold War tensions. We did not, the whole world was, kind of the Soviet bloc against the West, and the U.S. wanted Indonesia to be primarily leaning toward the West. The good part of this period was that Suharto really encouraged economic development and encouraged foreign direct investment. And this was the time when a lot of foreign companies began to establish manufacturing facilities and so forth in Indonesia. And there's a lot of growth for about 3 decades. And unfortunately, in 1997, there was an Asian financial crisis actually started in Thailand. The whole Southeast Asia became difficult economically. But at the same time, over this time, Suharto's administration, the corruption just grew and grew and grew. And there was significant suppression of political opposition. And people became unhappy. And there were a lot of student protests and so forth. And that ended Suharto's presidency in 1998. Well, since then, the democratic processes have been strengthened. There was a first presidential election in 2004. There's been 3 or 4 additional presidencies during or since that time. Some of them short-lived, as short as a year. However, we don't want to get carried away too much with the democratic movement, because during all this time, the military has been dominated, which is really limiting the democratic elected government's power. One lens that you can look at Indonesia is through the corruption index that's done by Transparency International. And Indonesia has a score of 34, which is relatively low. In other words, high corruption. It is a major problem. In another program I saw, many interviews with people, people were really unhappy about the amount of corruption. The areas that are big areas of corruption were actually in the justice and civil service sectors. Corruption within the justice sector is seen by its ineffectiveness to enforce laws, failure to uphold justice, hence really undermining the rule of law, which again is a major deal and something that we're facing in many other countries such as Hungary, and frankly, to some extent, here challenged in the United States. So it is a big deal. But corruption is really a big deal in Indonesia, because they have lost as much as $238 million in US dollars in corruption in 2011, mostly through investment. The government investment was the major area. Well, when there's lots of money flowing through government projects and so forth, much opportunity for embezzlement. You know, your friends get the jobs, get the contracts, and then there's kickbacks. But just in regular business, companies are concerned about the red tape and basically you needing to bribe to get contracts and licenses and permits. So that's been a major problem. But average citizens also really complain about bribes and expectation of gifts and special treatments by Indonesian officials, significantly the police. People do not trust the police, which is, again, a major problem because that encourages crime and further corruption. So not a good situation. This is not exclusive to Indonesia. In Africa, where I've been involved a great deal for the last 4 years, corruption is the major reason why those countries do not expand economic very well. And it is a significant drag on the Indonesia's economy as well. It's one reason why its per capita income is so low as compared to the other Asian tigers of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so forth. They just are not keeping up with some of those Asian tigers. However, the good news is the ease of doing business score has actually improved to somewhat over the few years. So maybe there's a little bit of help, a little bit of bright light there. Another problem that Indonesia has is personal freedom is significantly constrained. Political rights is, basically fixed elections is a major problem. Big money in influencing elections, a big problem. Civil liberties are poor. And many of the human rights organizations, they highlight as far as issues, the Western Guinea region, that area that was little inhabited, lightly inhabited by the indigenous people. There's some real human rights issues there. Bad treatment based on religion, gender and sexual minorities, sexual and reproductive rights, rights of women, children, LGBT, and the disabled, and really the freedom of expression and association. It's really limited. However, the current president, Joko Widodo, known as Joko Wi, he actually acknowledged the past human rights abuses, including the massacres of anti-communists, by the anti-communists. And also he highlighted the human rights violations of the Papua area region. That's the West New Guinea. And he said that these human rights violations would never happen again. Well, easier said than done. So now Indonesia has a very strategic position in this area. As you can see, you've got a whole lot of big countries and a lot of trade amongst these countries. Basically, with the access to the ocean, it facilitates trade a lot. But critical to Indonesia is it's got some areas here that are some bottlenecks. Right here, going through here and through here, you've got some bottlenecks that estimated that about 1,000 ships pass through those areas each week. That's a lot of traffic through two small areas. So it's a very, very critical area. Let's look at Asia's foreign policy now. Its main idea was we're going to be non-aligned. We're not going to take sides in the Cold War. But actually, it did enjoy quite a bit of U.S. support during those Suharto's 32 years. Again, we didn't want it. We didn't want it to go communist. But it was significant in being really the leader of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because they wanted to promote strong international trade and regional security. That started with Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, and Thailand. And since then, Vietnam has joined this as tried to counter the power of China. So that's really been its foreign policy focus on promoting trade, promoting economic development, and basically what's good for business. It's grown to become a member of the G20 that they meet, at least annually and talk about major economic issues. And generally, it's been a reliable vote in the United Nations with the US. Again, except for issues regarding the Palestinians and Israel. But also generally, it's been quiet and compliant, and usually deferring to the general trends of Western Bloc international diplomacy. Again, what's good for business. But another bad points of what's happened in Indonesia, around 1975, Portugal kind of gave up its domination of the East Timor island, half of the island of Timor. And Indonesia wanted that as one of its provinces. So along with the idea of one nation, one people, one language of this whole string of islands. So Indonesia invaded East Timor. And during that time, it was about a four-year period, about 300,000 of the East Timor population were killed. That's about 25% of them. So that was a major genocide. It's called the forgotten genocide because, number one, Indonesia doesn't want to talk about it. And, Indonesia is kind of invisible in the first place. So not much has been paid attention to it. And during the Cold War, the United States sort of turned a blind eye for this because the United States wanted to continue to support Indonesia against the communists. So sometimes you have to choose between two evils. And during that time, the United States chose the anti-communist versus talking too much about this. Anyway, Indonesia governed Timor as its 27th province. And then in 1999, they relinquished control because they needed a major bridge loan from the International Monetary Fund. In 1997, we mentioned the Asian financial crisis. Well, Indonesia needed these loans so they didn't, they could recover from that crisis. So that was a condition. Indonesia gave that up, and since then, East Timor has been independent. Well, today we've got a very delicate situation there because Indonesia has a major challenge with China, as well as many of the other countries in that area, and obviously the United States. China has done some industrial scale fishing in Indonesia's territorial waters, which is a big deal for Indonesia. And also China is claiming the South China Sea, which stretches all the way from Indonesia all the way up to Taiwan. But it has this growing economic dependence on China. Earlier, I showed you the imports and export major countries that are the major partners for Indonesia. China is number one on both imports and exports, major trading partner. So it's a delicate balance. You need them, but boy, you've got some things you don't like about them too much. One of the major U.S. policy goals is balancing China with alliances with countries in the region, including Indonesia. So it's a delicate balance. Particularly, China has invested in Indonesia as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, trying to create trade pathways very similar to the old Silk Road. China has major infrastructure projects in many countries, including many in Southeast Asia and many in Africa, as China seeks to extend its influence around the world. But Indonesia continues to try to maintain the middle ground. And just like during not wanting to be aligned during the Cold War area, it is very, very wary of becoming a pawn for any other country. Now, so the big question is, where does Indonesia go from here? I already mentioned there's a big question of what does the Indonesia economy do? Does it get trapped in that middle income trap, or does it actually continue to grow and become the fourth largest economy in the world, like some economists believe? But there's also a very critical issue concerning where does it go politically? Because Indonesia has a presidential election next Wednesday. And they've got one of the current president, who's very, very popular, Jokowi, is barred from running for a third term due to term limits. Very similar to the United States, you have term limits. Right now, there are 3 primary president, vice president combos that are competing. The pair that's favored to win includes Prabowo Subianto, and he is the ex-president of Suharto's second daughter. Little bit of family connection there. What it's really concerning by a lot of people is he's a military man and a member of the Special Forces in East Timor in 1976, and also complicit in other atrocities. Well, his running mate is also Jokowi's eldest son. Yeah, so Suharto's connection, Jokowi's connection. So the big question is, will Indonesia continue down the path of dynastic intergenerational control, where the real control is by the political and business elites in the military? Alternative, will it be more democratic? Well, some people say even if one of the other 2 pairs win, how much will really change? Because in the past, where there's been elections, well, there may have been appearances that things have changed, but in the end, the elites in the military continue to control things. So what is Indonesia's future? Which way will Indonesia go? And this is going to be, it may be largely determined by the young people. 114 million out of a total 201 million voters are under the age of 40. Mean age of Indonesia is 29 years old, very similar to India. And as compared to China and South Korea and Japan and so forth, and the United States, which now the average age is much older. But there's a whole generation there wanting greater economic opportunity. And they feel that this is being thwarted by the corruption among the elites and the police forces. So which way will Indonesia go? I don't know. We'll find out after next Wednesday's election and then succeeding events. But the Indonesia's elections are being termed one of the sternest tests for democracy's progress. So it's a very, very important area, invisible to most of the world, important in terms of size of country, size of population, size of economy, and very important in that very volatile area and potentially chaotic area in Southeast Asia. So with that, we'll go to questions that you may have put in the Q&A. But one of the key questions that somebody may wish to weigh in on is, what should be the United States posture with all this? Because we are seeking to influence things there, but just what can we do that will actually do some good?
So Rick, I'll thank you for that. And just a reminder to add your questions as well as comments to Rick's question about what the United States should be doing to the question and answer, and I'll read them to Rick. We have one question right now that I think relates to some of the bottlenecks you talked about with shipping, but Jim asks, what would happen to the Strait of Malacca if China attempts to invade Taiwan, and would India, Indonesia, or another country attempt to close the strait?
Oh, major problem, major issue. That's really unknown. Right now, the United States is practicing what's been called for years and years the strategic ambiguity. In other words, not really stating how seriously would we defend Taiwan. And that really also relates to many of these other countries because we have strategic alliances with many of these other countries too, Philippines and so forth. And so, first of all, the big unknown is what will China do? Will they really assert their wish to have Taiwan join the rest of China? Everybody hopes they will not do that. Taiwan is very fearful of that because they have witnessed what's happening in Hong Kong, where Hong Kong was supposed to be, two separate. It became a part of China, but two separate economies, basically. But over time, Hong Kong has really been overrun by China in terms of power and so forth. It's no longer even deemed at all independent. So Taiwan does not want to go that way. The big question is obviously, first of all, whether China would invade Taiwan. What would be the U.S. response? And would China, how would that affect some of these other countries that we have a strategic alliance with? So, boy, that's a big, important question. And I just got to say, that's just a huge unknown.
Mm-hmm. So another question is, what is the relationship with Indonesia and Australia, considering how close they are?
Okay, a good question because the invasion in 1975 by Indonesia of East Timor really upset Australia. So there's been a tension between Australia and Indonesia since then. So one of the big hopes for the region is that there would be some lessening of that tension between the two countries, and so that they could cooperate more. But as I showed in the export-import area, Australia is a big trade partner already, and Australians are a major part of the tourism industry in Indonesia. So although there's some tension, there is a lot of significant interaction between the two countries. So it's not, I wouldn't say hostile, but the hope is that they would be able to work more closely together.
I'll do a follow-up question too. In the charts you presented, I didn't see anything about Vietnam. So do they have any relationship with Vietnam?
Well, originally, during the Cold War and during the Vietnam War era, there was a great anti-communist push in Indonesia because they did not want communism to come to Indonesia. So there was a lot of tension there. But since then, with the expansion and greater power of China and the tension of China trying to squeeze some of these Southeast Asia countries, and frankly, Vietnam has really grown as an economic power as well. Many of the industries that were initially started in China, some of them have moved their manufacturing plants into Vietnam to take advantage of their low-wage laborers. Anyway, because of this fear of China being too dominant, that's why Vietnam has joined the Association of Southeast Nations. So it's kind of really joined hands with Indonesia now.
So one of our attendees wants to know, could you describe more about the other two candidates for election?
I read something about it, but I don't know that much, other than they are somewhat high profile, have good media exposure, and one has been the governor of one of the major regions in the area, and the other, I believe, what came from a major industry position. So they have a lot of media exposure, and there's great concern in Indonesia about the misinformation in social media right now, just like here in the United States. So that's a major issue, and although there's the two favored pair, there is some uncertainty in this because um, so many of the young people, they are really opposed to the current situation with the elites and the military being in power. And so that throws some really unknowns into the situation. So the world will be watching. What's the status of democracy? Are we going to continue that authoritarian trend that we see in many countries in the world, or what? Big deal. But neither of the other two pairs are really dominant, but they're duking it out. We'll see.
And maybe some potential for some instability post-election here too.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the human rights in Indonesia and those abuses. Your slide had a lot of information on it. And so could you talk a little bit more about that and any movement to make the country more tolerant?
Well, as I said, there is 87% of Indonesia is Muslim. So wherever there's differences of religion, there's going to be differences of opinion, and some discrimination based on that. It seems like religion has caused more problems in the world than anything else, and Indonesia is not unique in that. But the biggest issue with Muslim is really the anti-women, anti-LGBT issues, more than just religion. Although those are maybe part of the Islam, Muslim religion. So there is discrimination based on that. So that's a major issue. There's also well, with as diverse a country as Indonesia is, Java has over the island of Java, where Jakarta is located, has more than half of the population. And some of those less populated islands in the country, their economies are not as strong, and they're just not as well represented and so forth as the island of Java. So that's an issue. There seems to be some discrimination based on some identities, although they really try to stress the idea of one country, one people, one language, so forth. But that's not a perfect marriage. Let's put it that way. I don't know.
Well, yeah, with 17,000 islands, I mean, it's just a lot to pull into one.
Yeah, I don't know if any marriage is perfect, but that one probably is not. So those are the major human rights issues. But just the major corruption, the opportunity for the elites, the government officials, the police, to be discriminatory. That just causes all kinds of problems. So there's numerous issues involved in that question. So again, it's not unique to Indonesia, but some of its diversity has obviously created some of the issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned that, I mean, it's a young country. They've got a lot of voters who are looking for some change. Is it mostly the economy that is driving some of the changes that people are looking at, or are there other issues that people are latching onto as they look at this election?
Well, by and large, the economy is growing. Unemployment, last statistic I saw was 3.5%, which is not bad. The problem is people just aren't making much money. And I saw an interview where one woman was working 4 jobs to support her family. The wages are low. maybe higher than some other countries in Southeast Asia or China now, but they're still very low. So it's very hard to support a family. The dream that they have, many of them have, is just like here, to own your own home, perhaps own a car, and contribute to the traffic jams. But those dreams are pretty much universal around the world. You want to be able to raise your kids. You want your kids to get an education well, and many people are struggling basically compared to our 70,000 something average per capita. They're in the 4,000 range. So they're just not making a lot of money. And so that's a major driver, just like in many parts of the world. The youth, it's a major problem. It's a major problem in getting jobs for the youth in China, a major problem in many of those countries. And so, the young folks are really beginning to wonder, what is their future in the world? And here in the United States, we've got many of the same issues. Our younger generation do not feel they've got the same opportunities that basically you and I have had. We've been lived through a golden years, as far as I'm concerned. We've got issues with our national debt. We've got jobs. We've got climate change. We've got a whole lot of issues that are not being solved by our own government. Indonesia has got very similar problems. Their young folks are concerned about what their future will be.
And actually, a question I have is about climate change with so many islands. Are they talking much, or is part of the focus with some of these elections, as well as beyond that, on the impact of climate change on island nations that we see with Indonesia?
In the stuff I've read and studied, I haven't seen much about that. However, it's interesting. I mentioned before that there's many rivers flowing through Jakarta, which causes some major flooding during monsoons. Well, monsoons are becoming stronger throughout the world. So you can understand that if there's already major flooding issues in Jakarta with stronger monsoons, that's going to even be a bigger problem, which may be in the back of people's mind of why they've had to move the capital to the island of Borneo. So, with monsoons being a major issue in the December period through that area, and they're getting stronger, but they've got to be concerned about that.
Yeah, and rising sea levels too.
Yeah, well, how much the rising sea levels will affect some of the islands, that was never mentioned in what I've read, but it would probably be affecting at least some of their areas.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about East Timor, and is that whole island independent, and who controlled the other half of the island? Is there a foreign presence there now?
Yeah, it's actually divided in two, and the western part is part of Indonesia, while the eastern part is now independent. It was actually run by the UN for a little while before, until they got their feet under them, and East Timor became independent. But the west end is Indonesia. So it's a kind of divided island, just like Borneo. Indonesia has part of it, Malaysia has part of it, and I forget who's got the other small piece. So some of these islands are not totally dominated by one country.
Mm-hmm. I have two questions about the language spoken there. I mean, one is just what is the language, and then the other relates to if it's one people, one language, how is these islands, so many islands, is that really true that it's one country, one language?
Good question, because I don't remember the number, but the number of ethnic languages in Indonesia is huge, in the hundreds. But the official language is what they call Indonesian. And what they did when they became independent, they chose a language, not the ruling language of the major island of Java, because that would be considered kind of favoring one area versus the other. So what was the official language of business at the time, which was understood pretty much through all the islands. And that became the official Indonesian language. Although, like I say, it's linguistically diverse. You go to West New Guinea among the indigenous people, and maybe the official Indonesian language would not be understood.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about the education system in Indonesia?
There does appear to be a strong educational system there. From what I've seen anyway, I saw no indication that people are unhappy with the ability to get educated. But I have to admit a little bit of ignorance on that point.
Yeah, so if it's free, public, or,
Yeah, it does seem to be that there is a lot of public education, although I'm sure the elites in the military have their own private schools. Wherever you have money,
yeah.
the people with money benefit.
Are there any serious separatist or ethnic minority movements inside Indonesia?
Not currently that I've heard about. However, there is, I forget the name of the little area in the very, very northwest part of Indonesia. There is a part that um, is it's run differently. It's basically been allowed to be ruled and governed by Shia law. And so, it's kind of unusual. It's allowed to be governed differently than the rest of the area. But I wasn't aware in any of the stuff I've read, I've not heard of any separatist movements.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit about, Indonesia has been historically liberal Muslim nation and concerns about the rise of a more narrow approach to Sunni Islam?
Again, that's not something that I'm familiar with, although, uh, is the Muslim area, elite do have significant impact um, in how things are run there. And with the discrimination against basically the women's rights and LGBT, obviously that's one of the areas where that influence has been exercised. But again, I did not hear about how it's getting any more illiberal than normal. Um, so it's really considered to be a pretty safe country to go to and travel around, and so um, I didn't read of any major movements one way or the other than just they want to keep growing, and they want to keep elite, and the police and the military want to stay in control. They may change things. They may change the appearance, but the bottom underneath stays the same.
Yeah. So maybe there's more tolerance around tourism too, and welcoming people with diverse backgrounds and ideations.
Yeah, there does not seem to be any issue with people from other countries and other beliefs and whatnot coming to the country and seeing what there is there.
Mhm. We have a question too about just, Jakarta being so densely populated. Is there a housing crisis in some of the larger cities?
Housing is the issue everywhere, particularly for the very, very low income. It is just absolutely densely populated, and the traffic jams are apparently epic. And I've been in some pretty interesting traffic jams in Nepal, but with pictures I saw of Jakarta, I just put those to shame. Lots of motorcycles, lots of cars, all will go in the same direction, and it looks like if there are 3 lanes that are painted, they're totally ignored. And if you can fit 5 or 6 cars across, that's how they go. But housing, like I say, with the population still growing, there's just you know, where does everybody go? And how, and with those low incomes, how can you afford much of anything?
Mhm. And how about public transportation? You know, do you see much of that in Indonesia, in the bigger towns?
It still looks like the automobile is the major means of transportation, automobile and motorcycle. But there was one of the major Belt and Road initiatives it was a big train um, network that was paid for by China. I forget what cities they were connecting, but so there's some movement in that direction. But um, obviously one of the problems when everything is so jammed, there's really no room to even build anything. And so it does not appear to be, in the pictures I've seen of the jams, I've not seen a single bus, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it does not appear that there's all that significant or that great a public infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Which contributes to, it's a cyclical thing there too, so.
Yeah.
So I know that you posed the question about just what role the US should be playing. We do have a question of what role, if any, is the US playing in this election this week?
I don't know that the US is playing any role in the election. That I've not seen any indication whatsoever. But the desire of the US obviously is that whoever is elected, that there be a continuation of the desire to work collectively in Southeast Asia nations, both through the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but also more closely working with what's called the Quad. There's really a sort of a partnership alliance. United States, Japan, Australia, and India has tried to counter China's influence. They really want Indonesia to, as one of the major countries in that region, right in the middle of that Quad, to be joining that. From what I've read, that does not really seem to be the major election issues, though, in Indonesia. It's kind of like the saying in the United States on elections: "It's the economy, stupid." It's those individual issues that affect you individually, personally, that are really driving what you're thinking. They're not looking at the geopolitical or geoeconomical geoeconomic issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking more at the impact on individuals and their families. Which brings me to a question here. So can you talk a little bit about the economic inequality in Indonesia? Like, do we have a middle class, or
Oh,
we kind of have?
oh, one of the measures of income equality is what's called the Gini index, Gini, an organization that measures that. And it has income inequality not that different from Canada, not that terribly different from the United States. Which, having said that, we have income inequality here in Canada, and there certainly is that in Indonesia. Again, because of the influence of the oligarchs running the big businesses, the influence of the elites and the military. Those who have power get what they want, and those who don't have the power don't get much. And that's pretty much how the world works. It's reality, whether we like it or not. So, is it awful? Not as bad as some countries, but it could be better. Let's put that. The hope is that it could be better.
Mm-hmm. We have a question just about one of the languages being Tagalog. I don't know if you're familiar with.
That I'm not. No.
So someone also asked about the Rohingya refugees. Is that something that we think about with Indonesia and just the impact of those refugees?
Again, that's not something that I read as an issue. Um, it's obviously it's not an area that's islands away from major migration areas. It's not easy to get to. It's not like in former Burma, Vietnam, which has major issues. People coming from Bangladesh and so forth. Pretty hard to swim that far. And there really does not appear to be all that terribly much immigration out of Indonesia. Whereas many of the Southeast Asian nations have had quite a few people come to the United States, Indonesia has not. That's not been a major movement from Indonesia. So it's somewhat different. Like we've had a lot of Cambodians and a lot of Vietnamese and so forth, Thais and so forth come to the United States. There's not that many Indonesians.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like Indonesians in general are not immigrating outside of the country either to other places,
Does not sound like it. It's not
Australia or,
no.
Interesting.
It's a lot like, to some extent, Africa. In many places, things are not good. But where do you go? Places around you are not that much better, that's accessible. So what do you do? Where do you go? You have nowhere place to go. What do you do? So even those people who are not necessarily all that happy in Indonesia, is Malaysia any better? That's an autocratic country as well. Vietnam any better? And so forth. Is Philippines any better? They've got the same kinds of issues in all these countries. Not really doing that terribly well.
Is there an Indonesian company that we would recognize by name that you're aware of?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I would think with nickel being so important, we're gonna know about some countries there or companies there. Although I'm not certain whether that is a government-owned enterprise or not. So it's but with the need for nickel for building batteries or fight climate change, that will probably be more in the news in the future. Whether there's a major palm oil company, I don't know. That it's a major palm oil supplier around the world, but again, palm oil does not come into my daily life, and I haven't haven't heard of any company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does seem like Indonesia has a diversified economy, at least when you looked at all of the different areas where they're exporting.
Yeah, like I say, Indonesia is pretty much invisible. We know very little about Indonesia, as important as it is and important it's going to be. It's really strange how that can be.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's also part of their, trying to play the middle. They're not getting involved with a lot of the conflicts or taking sides.
Well, yeah, it's oftentimes the middle is difficult because you get squeezed from both sides, but so far they've been pretty much able to kind of play both sides against the middle. Just try to against each other for their benefit, I should say, and see if they can just coexist. Mm-hmm. What's good for business, what's good for the economy, that's their big focus.
So a follow-up question. So with Jakarta moving, with the capital moving, what's going to happen to Jakarta? What do you think?
Oh, I think that will probably continue to be the center of the economy. You can move the government buildings and those functions, but the economy probably won't move very much. Over time, some probably, All the lobbying enterprises and so forth will move, but those are not the major drivers of the economy. So I expect Jakarta to remain a very crowded, very traffic jammed area.
And an area where there's a lot of production going on too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting place to visit, I understand, but like I say, it's kind of like my home area at Upper Peninsula, Michigan. Interesting place to grow up, but you just don't want to go back there.
So one of our listeners today did come up with a company. Pertamina is the only Indonesian company in Fortune Global 500. So
Huh,
I don't know if
never
anyone's heard
heard
of that one, but there's one example. And then another listener said Java used to mean coffee. How big is their coffee export?
It was not mentioned as far as the major exports.
Interesting.
Yeah. But I only went down to the top 5, so I mean, maybe 6th or 7th, who knows?
Yeah. And then another interesting question here is just Obama lived in Indonesia for a while as a child. Are there any pockets of Americans that lived there, and why?
Not that I know of,
Mhm.
which doesn't mean much. Could well be.
So those
I've learned a lot in this preparation, but I'm far from the top expert. Let's put it that way.
well, and like you said too, uh, where it's not front of mind, at least for us in the US. And so, it is an interesting issue of, what do we know about Indonesia in this part of the world?
Yeah, but I would say Obama spending years in Indonesia sure probably made him more sensitive to diversity. So that probably had some impact on how he looks at the world. And then living in Hawaii, again, same thing. We are our perceptions are largely determined by our background, and so I'm sure those were formative years for him that were very important for him.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, and added to his perspectives. Yeah, so keep asking any questions. Use the Q&A as well as just the question that Rick threw out there about just what role do we think the U.S. should be playing in this region of the world. You know, do you see, I mean, I know China is such a huge impact in that whole region. Do you think that China has its eyes on controlling more of Indonesia?
It's been kind of interesting because in what I read, in Suharto's era, when all this foreign domestic uh, investment was invited, um, they were really invited Chinese companies to do that, to come in. And there are major conglomerates and so forth within Indonesia that are communist, or excuse me, that are China owned. And one reason they felt willing to do that is because they never felt that Chinese influence could be impactful on individual elections because of the difference in cultures and so forth. So they've really welcomed China's investment into Indonesia. Does China wish to exert more influence in there? I don't see, or nothing that you read in the news or hear in the news is China's desire to take over Indonesia like it wishes Taiwan, because Taiwan was at one point considered part of China, and in China's eyes is and still always will be part of China. But that same logic does not apply to Indonesia. So does China want Indonesia to continue to be a good export market for China's goods? Certainly. And does it want to dominate the area? We believe so. But that's one of the big things that how do you really determine what another country's intentions really are? You really don't know how much is that defensive, how much is that really aggressive, that you want to take over the world. Now we know that the Soviet Union's initial idea was, evangelistic. We need to expand communists around the whole world. Well, China has not really shown that characteristic. Yes, it wants to have influence in all these countries, including Africa and all over the place. But do we see any real evidence that it wants to enslave or dominate some other country by taking over? Not really. So, we are left sort of guessing at what are China's really, what are their intentions? We really don't know.
And how about with Japan, given the history of occupation of this region during, before World War II? What's the relationship with like Japan?
Right now, it's really quite good. Yes, Japan really is infamous for some of the atrocities that it did during World War II, but there does not seem to be major tension between Japan and Indonesia at this point. They're a major trading partner, and I think they're pretty much just resolved themselves that we're business partners and we're going to do business with each other and we're going to get along, and we need the international order that has benefited these countries of trade and so forth. So there does not seem to be any lingering tensions between those two countries. They're I don't know whether you call it circling the wagons or however you want to call it, but there's many of these countries are really looking at how do we counter China's influence, and we're sort of in the same boat together. And so there's a certain amount of commonality there.
Mm-hmm. A question about so much of the economy being government owned. So who controls these operations? Is it the military or the elites?
Well, I did hear mention about oligarchs. So I'm sure there are a group of elite, but where does the military and the elite merge? Where do they differ? I don't know. So it's just I'm left with the impression, however, that the presidential and the governmental mechanisms are relatively ineffective, even though they're quote government owned. Those rulers or those company leaders or whatever, with their power of the purse, they can get done pretty much whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. With all the corruption that's going on, and
that's the problem. So
mm-hmm.
One thing that I didn't mention as far as U.S. involvement in the area is throughout the Cold War and continuing through this day, the U.S. has done a significant amount of training and providing military assistance to Indonesia, training it on how to become a modern military force. Again, with the idea that may be needed to counter China. So we do have influence within the military, but I don't know that we have any influence in the military in terms of who does what.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in increasing its effectiveness, but other than that, and how to have a performance-based promotions and so forth, rather than on who you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a question about, separate from the issue of disinformation in this election, have past elections been considered free and fair?
Most people there believe that the elections um, have not been really fair, been pretty much rigged, although probably not as much as in Russia today, which I just read the news that the anti-war candidate, the major opponent against um, Putin, has been ruled ineligible to run for election. When you eliminate all your opponents, it's pretty hard to say it's a fair election. And I don't know that exactly that's what's happened in Indonesia, but most people feel that one election after another has been pretty well run by this intergenerational group. It's because they exert so much power. And one thing I haven't mentioned: why does the Suharto group have so much power? Well, Suharto is believed to have embezzled somewhere between 15 and 35 billion dollars from Indonesia. So when you start accumulating that much money into a family group, you begin to have a bit of influence.
Yeah, and just being able to control the media even, and just,
Yes.
being able to get their message out.
Yeah, because suppression of the media and free expression, that's been one of the complaints by the ethics and civil liberties groups.
Mhm. So I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do we see many NGOs operating in Indonesia? I'm thinking like environmental NGOs, or you know, just dealing with some of maybe the poverty or any of those issues.
I haven't read too much about that. However, I know there's some movements, particularly with regard to the palm oil industry, in that there is a lot of rising resistance to the clear cutting of the tropical rainforest to provide more planting areas for palm oil, very similar to the issues in Brazil. So that's an issue. So there's some NGOs involved in those discussions. There's also some with regard to Borneo and retaining the native environment there. So there's a little bit of environmental issues there, but other than that, I didn't read about any of the any other NGOs.
Mhm. Well, that's all of our questions, Rick. So do you have any last minute comments and before I wrap things up for today?
Well, just a general thing. I don't know I'd want to live in Indonesia, but it sure sounds like a country and many of its islands and tourism features that would be very interesting to go see. So this has piqued my interest to add to my 44 countries to go see some of that. Because how often you go to a tropical rainforest? Uh, how often do you see orangutans? How often do you see a number of these things that are available there? So, might be someplace others might be interested in going to see too.
Yes, it sounds like just fascinating, and just with all of those volcanoes, and I mean, I'm sure that it's a stunning, beautiful place to
Yeah.
visit. So
Obviously, with that much rainfall, it's a green area.
yes, it's lush. So
Yeah.
well, thank you, Rick, for a very informative presentation. And I also want to thank Paul, who's been providing behind the scenes help today. We'll start up the Great Decisions series again on April 26th when we have our spring term, Ollie's spring term. We have Todd Lefko coming, who's going to speak about climate technology and competition. And for those of you who are Ollie members, you should have gotten your spring guide already, or you will be getting it shortly. And if you want to take a look at it now, you can also see it on the website, which is Olli, olli.umn.edu. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again in April. Thank you.
Have a good day, all.
All right, bye.